220 a day. That's 154 a week, 616 a month, for a total of 7,392 veterans that have committed suicide in 2010 alone. My boyfriend of 8 years and I lived in many veteran-only housing complexes and saw firsthand the effect of neglect had on our veterans. The men and women that have risked their lives and their freedoms for us to have ours are often taken for granted. We owe it to them to address the suicide crisis and to paint an accurate picture of where we currently are with this crisis. I'll share the key findings from the most recent report on suicide data, and I'll explain what post-traumatic stress disorder is and how it relates to our veterans since the Vietnam era. Let's start with the most recent report published by the Veterans Administration with data collected from 2017. The key findings include data only concerning veterans as well as comparisons to non-veteran data or civilian data. As defined in the report and in my speech, a veteran is a former member of the military that has an honorably discharged status. From 2008 to 2017, the number of veteran suicides has exceeded 6,000 annually. And although veterans only accounted for 7.9% of the U.S. population in 2017, they made up 13.9% of all U.S. adult suicide deaths. It wasn't until 2008 that the veteran suicide rate began exceeding non-veteran adults' rate in the U.S., and the statistics put it at 1.5 times more. With a better idea behind veteran suicide and civilian suicide data rates in the U.S., I'll share about one of the main factors that lead to it and how it specifically relates to our veteran population. Post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, is a common mental illness diagnosis that was created with Vietnam veterans in mind. Knowing about its origins helps with understanding its criteria. The diagnosis was to help combat stigma and contribute effects of the war to symptoms that returning Vietnam vets were experiencing. In an article from Journal of Clinical Psychology, they explain that this is why the second criteria is flashbacks and nightmares, something that the Vietnam vets commonly complained about. Other populations beyond Vietnam vets quickly related to the symptoms of PTSD as well. Because traumatic events happen often, like car accidents, most of us probably know someone who matches the criteria for the diagnosis. And because PTSD could be present in yourself or a loved one, it's important to know the signs. PTSD is divided into 3 categories: re-experiencing, avoidance, and hyperarousal symptoms. Re-experiencing has to do with the traumatic event and reliving it at random moments. Avoidance or numbing often comes after re-experiencing the trauma. This involves detaching not only from yourself but from loved ones as well while experiencing it. Hyper or increased arousal can be exhibited in many ways, like problems with focus, anger, sleep, and being easily startled. So PTSD may have been created for veterans, but we know that many other types of people suffer from re-experiencing, avoiding, and displaying increased arousal from traumatic events as well. Now that we have a better understanding of what PTSD and how the diagnosis came about, you're probably wondering how it relates to veterans and their increased suicide rate in the U.S. Veterans face many of the same hardships that non-veteran adults do in the U.S. when it comes to mental health, with PTSD and other diagnoses playing a huge part in the growing suicide rate. Problems lay with receiving adequate care and with the symptoms themselves. The veterans seek care for PTSD at the same rates as other adults in the U.S. For veterans, out of those that meet the criteria for PTSD, about 57% have not been diagnosed. Then those that are diagnosed, less than half will have received care within the last year. An article from University of Tennessee Health Science conducted a study connecting PTSD to suicide among veterans. They described PTSD as carrying an increased physical and psychological health risk in soldiers. The studies found that PTSD Long-term effects increase the risk of cardiovascular problems, tobacco use, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, substance abuse, depression, and made them twice as likely to develop dementia. And it's these long-term effects that can lead to such a severe isolation and sense of hopelessness that the men and women who dedicated and risked their lives to help and protect ours, while being promised by military recruiters that they would be set for life if they enlisted, only to fall through the cracks when they return home, they realize the reality of their service and how it's getting them nowhere in life. And they decide that enough is enough and they put a stop to the suffering themselves. To summarize what our veterans suffering from PTSD can endure, it's substance abuse, homelessness, unhealthy behaviors, various addictions, less productivity, physical ailments, consequences that affect family, social functioning, finances, and parenting. The American Suicidology found that for each suicide that occurred, 135 people were exposed or knew the person. Thinking back on the 22 vets that commit suicide daily, that's 990,528 people that are affected by the loss every year. The numbers don't lie, and the numbers are showing that there's a serious, serious problem with our service members who we owe our freedom and very lives to. And then the studies have shown us that PTSD is one of the leading causes, as all of the symptoms from it lead to damage in all aspects of life. That tends to lead to an all-around hopelessness, which can end with suicide. I'm asking that we take action and encourage us students to frequently search on PCC's Give Pulse website for volunteer opportunities involving veterans. And if you can't make a time commitment like volunteering, although veterans have made the ultimate commitment to us and our freedoms, at least help to keep them from staying in the dark, and by talking about them and reminding everyone that they need us and that we owe them.